Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be continuing our read through of D'Aulaire's book of Greek myths. I'm excited. I'm glad that you guys are happy about the continuation of this book because I'm happy too. It also just started pouring rain outside, so you might be able to hear that. It's kind of nice. So tonight we are going to read and show you. I remember loving this page in particular as a kid. I thought the family tree was fascinating. Tonight, since the stories get kind of long to the point that we're at now, tonight we're just going to read about Heracles, Theseus, and Oedipus. The very long stories, as you'll see. And then we'll get into the Adventures of Jason next week, and it will come to an end. So let's dive right in and begin with Heracles. I'm going to try to get as much as I can into the shot, but you know what? I'm going to kind of just focus on the pictures more than, because the pictures are really cool, right? Let's get into the story. Heracles. Proudly did the muses sing of Heracles, often called Hercules, the strongest man who ever lived on earth and the greatest of all the descendants of Daedalus. His mother was Princess Alcmena, granddaughter of Perseus and Andromeda, and famed for her beauty and virtue. His father was Zeus, so Hera, of course, hated Alcmena and pursued Heracles with her wrath. When he was an infant, the goddess sent 2 spotted serpents into his cradle, but little Heracles simply grasped them in his powerful hands and squeezed the life out of them. He grew stronger every day, but his trouble was that he did not know his own strength. Being of noble birth, he had to learn to sing and play the lyre, but Heracles would much rather wrestle and fight. One day his music teacher Linus scolded him for singing out of tune. In a fit of fury, Heracles banged his lyre over the teacher's head, harder than he had meant, and the blow killed the poor man. Heracles was too strong to have around a palace, so he was sent into the mountains as a shepherd. There he could use his tremendous strength on prowling beasts. Soon he had rid the countryside around Thebes of lions and wolves, and the fame of his strength spread far and wide. He came back from the mountains as a hero, and the king of Thebes regarded him so highly that he gave him his daughter in marriage. Hera did not like this at all, and she made Heracles insane. Raving mad, he swatted down his own children, mistaking them for wild beasts. When he regained his senses, he was horrified at what he had done, and went to the Oracle of Delphi to learn what he must do to atone for his crime. He was told that he must serve for 10 years as the slave of his cousin Eurystheus, and perform 10 labors for him. Hera was pleased, for Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae, was a weak little man who hated his strong cousin Heracles. With her help, the king would surely think of the hardest tasks for Heracles to perform. For his first 4 labors, Eurystheus sent Heracles to rid the nearby countryside of dangerous beasts and monsters. In the valley of Nemea dwelt a monstrous lion whose hide was so tough it could not be pierced by any weapons. It was one of Echidna's dreadful offspring, which Zeus had let live as a challenge to future heroes. Heracles chased it out of its lair, seized it in his bare hands, and squeezed it to death. Then he skinned the beast with its own claws, and with the impenetrable skin of the Nemean lion slung over his head and shoulders, he reported back to Eurystheus, his first labor performed. In the swamps of Lerna there lived a 9-headed hydra, another of Echidna's brood. This monster was so poisonous that the fumes from its breath alone were enough to kill whatever came close to it. Heracles filled his enormous lungs with air, held his breath, and ran at the hydra. Swinging his club, he knocked off its heads, and one after the other they rolled to the ground. But no sooner had he knocked off one head than a new one grew in its place. He half turned round and let out enough air to call to his charioteer to bring a firebrand and sear the necks. Then no new heads could sprout. When Hera saw that Heracles was winning over the Hydra, she sent a giant crab to pinch his heel. With a mighty kick, Heracles sent the giant crab flying as he knocked off the last of the heads. Then he dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, making them so poisonous that a mere scratch from them was deadly. And he returned to Mycenae, his second labor performed. On the slopes of Mount Erymanthus roamed a wild and dreadful boar, over here, with tusks as sharp as swords. Eurystheus sent Heracles to bring this beast back alive. With loud yells, Heracles chased the boar out of its lair and drove it ahead of him all the way to the top of the snow-capped mountain. The heavy beast sank into the snow, and it was easy for Heracles to catch and subdue it. He pushed, dragged, and rolled it all the way down to the gates of Mycenae. When Eurystheus saw the fearful boar, he dived into an urn and barely dared to peek out. Then Eurystheus sent Heracles to rid the Stymphalian lake of a swarm of dangerous birds. They had feathers of brass so sharp that when one of them fell to the ground, it killed whomever it hit. But they could not penetrate Heracles' lion skin, and he made such a din with a huge rattle that the birds took fright and flew away, never to return. Eurystheus was distressed to see with what great ease Heracles had performed his first 4 labors. Now he sent him to bring back alive one of the sacred hinds of Artemis. He hoped that Heracles would harm the creature with his brute strength and thereby earn the wrath of the goddess. But Heracles pursued the swift deer with great patience over hills and dales. The year was almost over when at last he caught the deer. With great care he carried it back to Mycenae. Next, to humble his strong cousin, Eurystheus ordered Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas, who lived across the mountains in the west. King Augeas had huge herds, and his stables and barnyards had not been cleaned for years. Heaps of dung rose mountain high. No man alive could clean his stables in a year, thought Eurystheus. But Heracles, with tremendous strength, changed the course of 2 rivers. The waters flooded through the stables and barnyards and washed them clean in less than a day. Check out big old Heracles here in his lion skin. Eurystheus, now on the advice of Hera, sent Heracles far afield for his last 4 labors. He must travel way to the east and fetch back to Mycenae the golden girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were a tribe of wild and warlike women who rode better and fought harder than any men. Eurystheus was sure that even Heracles would be overwhelmed by the furious women. But when Heracles arrived in Amazon land, the proud queen was so taken by the sight of his bulging muscles that she gave him her belt without a fight. She would gladly have given him her hand in the bargain. But Hera, in the disguise of an Amazon, spread the rumor that Heracles had come to kidnap Hippolyta. The Amazons threw themselves upon Heracles, but for once they had found their master. Heracles swung his mighty club, and the little Amazon husbands, you can see them up here, who were spinning and cooking and tending the babies, were amazed to see their dangerous wives subdued by a single man. In triumph, Heracles returned to Mycenae with Hippolyta's belt. He could not bring the queen. She had been killed in the fight. Far to the north there lived a king whose name was Diomedes. He was a very inhospitable king and had trained his 4 mares to devour all strangers who came to his land. Now Eurystheus sent Heracles to capture the 4 man-eating mares and bring them back alive. Heracles traveled to the north, slew King Diomedes, and threw him to his own mares. When the mares had eaten the evil king, they were so tame that they let Heracles drive them back to the gates of Mycenae. Then Eurystheus sent Heracles south to catch a fierce, fire-breathing bull on the island of Crete. The Cretans, who were great bullfighters, could not catch the bull, but Heracles seized the charging bull by the horns without heeding the flames from its nostrils, flung it to the ground, and returned to Mycenae, bringing the subdued beast. Eurystheus was glad he had a safe urn to hide in. For his 10th labor, Heracles was sent to an island far out in the ocean to bring back a huge herd of red cows. They belonged to Geryon, a monster with 3 heads on 1 pair of legs. Heracles walked off with a powerful stride and soon reached the end of all land in the west. The only boat he could spot was the golden vessel of Helios, the sun. Heracles aimed his mighty bow at the sun and threatened to shoot him from the sky if he did not lend it to him. Helios did not dare refuse, and he let Heracles take his golden boat. Before he sailed off, Heracles pulled up 2 huge crags and set them down, one on each side of the strait that separates Europe from Africa. There they stand to this day, called the Pillars of Hercules. When Heracles was out at sea and the waves rose high around him, he aimed a poisoned arrow at the waves, threatening to shoot them if they did not still at once. The waves flattened in fear, and Heracles sailed on to Geryon's island. He began at once to load the herd of red cows, and Geryon's watchman and his 2-headed dog rushed at him. With one swing of his mighty club, Heracles did away with them both. Then Geryon himself came running to attack him, with his three huge bodies swaying on his thin legs. Calmly, Heracles lifted his bow, took careful aim, and sent a poisoned arrow through all of the monster's 3 bodies. As time was getting short, Heracles rode back as fast as he could with the herd. When he arrived at the mainland, Hera sent a swarm of gadflies to sting the cows, and they scattered all over Europe. Look at them go. Still, Heracles managed to round them up and bring them to the gates of Mycenae just before the year was up. There, Eurystheus sacrificed the cows to Hera, and gratified, the goddess whispered into his ear that he must demand 2 more labors from Heracles, for his charioteer had helped him to singe the heads of the Hydra, and not he but the waters of 2 rivers had washed the Aegean staples clean. Heracles scowled, but he bowed his head in submission, for he had won much glory on his 10 labors, and hoped to win some more. For his 11th labor, Heracles was sent to find Hera's secret garden of the Hesperides, and pick 3 golden apples from the little apple tree that Mother Earth had given Hera for her wedding gift. Nereus, the old gray man of the sea, was the only one on Earth who knew where the garden was, but he would not reveal the secret. When Heracles seized him to squeeze the secret out of him, Nereus tried to escape by changing himself into all kinds of animals. But Heracles held on to him, and at last Nereus had to tell him that the garden of the Hesperides lay west of the setting sun, not far from where the Titan Atlas stood, holding up the sky. On his way to the garden, Heracles heard the groans of the Titan Prometheus, who was chained to the Caucasus Mountains. Heracles was in a hurry, but he felt sorry for the Titan and took time off to tear apart his chains. Zeus, impressed by the strength of his son, let him do it. In gratitude, Prometheus warned Heracles not to pick the golden apples himself, or he would die. They were apples of immortality and could be picked only by a god. This drawing is so cool. We'll look at it in a minute. Heracles traveled over land and over sea, and at last he came to the garden of the Hesperides. Nearby stood the Titan Atlas, and Heracles offered to hold up the sky for him if he would pick 3 golden apples from Hera's tree. Atlas said he would be glad to be rid of his heavy burden for a while, but he feared the dragon Ladon, which lay under the tree, watching it with all the eyes of his 100 heads. A 100-headed dragon could not frighten Heracles. He drew his bow and shot it. Then he took the sky on his shoulders. Here's the picture. He took the sky on his shoulders. I lost my place. And Atlas reached out and picked the apples. The 3 little nymphs who tended the tree wept bitter tears, but they could not stop Atlas now that the watchful dragon was dead. There's the arrow. Heracles' knees started to buckle. So heavy was the weight of the sky, but Atlas stretched himself, enjoying his freedom. I might as well take these apples to Eurystheus myself, said the Titan, and started to walk away. Heracles well understood that Atlas had no intention of ever coming back, but he pretended to agree. Very well, he said. Just hold the sky while I make a pad of my lion skin. The sky is hard on my shoulders. This sounded reasonable to Atlas. He put down the golden apples and braced himself against the vault of the sky. Thank you for picking the apples, said Heracles, and hurried homeward. There we go. On his way to Mycenae, Heracles was stopped by the giant wrestler Antaeus. He lived in a hut beside the road and forced all travelers to wrestle with him. He was a son of Mother Earth and could not die as long as he touched her, so he always won and had built his hut of the skulls and bones of his victims. When Heracles threw the giant to the ground, thinking he was dead, but saw him springing up revived, he understood what was happening. Seizing Antaeus, he held him in the air until he had squeezed all life out of him. Heracles hurried on to Mycenae and gave the golden apples to Eurystheus. But Eurystheus did not dare to keep them. He gave them to Athena, who took them back to Hera's garden where they belonged. For his 12th labor, Heracles had to go to the underworld, capture Cerberus, the snarling 3-headed watchdog of Hades, and bring him to Mycenae. Heracles searched far and wide, till at last he found an entrance to the underworld, near Helios' evening place, far to the west. Setting his face in a terrible scowl, he walked straight down to Hades. The fluttering souls trembled, and Hades himself was so frightened at the sight that he told him to take the dog, only please not to treat it too roughly. Cerberus growled and lashed out with his spiked tail, but Heracles threw his arms around him and squeezed him till the dog's 3 tongues hung out. Look at. Ooh. Whining, Cerberus let Heracles drag him to the upper world and all the way to the gates of Mycenae. When Eurystheus saw the fearful hound once again, he dived into an urn and cowered there, not daring to make a sound. Heracles did not know what to do with the dog, so he dragged Cerberus all the way back down to Hades. Now Heracles was free. He had performed not only 10 but 12 labors. He had atoned for his sins, and Zeus was very pleased with his strong son. He was pleased with Hera, too, for she had unknowingly helped Heracles win more glory and fame than any other hero on earth. Admired by everyone, Heracles traveled all over Greece, performing more heroic deeds and making many friends. But Hera, still relentless, again made him insane, and he swatted men down like flies. When he recovered his senses, he once more had to atone for his sins, and this time it was his father, Zeus, who meted out his punishment, seeing to it that there was no glory to be won. Zeus sentenced Heracles to serve for 3 years as the slave of Queen Omphale of Lydia. She dressed him in women's clothes and made the strongest man in the world sit at her feet, spinning and sewing with his huge hands, while she herself donned his lion skin and brandished his club. Heracles grumbled and groaned, but he did as he was ordered. When his 3 years at last were over, he had learned his lesson of humility. Again he performed heroic deeds, and his friends were glad to see him back. One of his great friends was Admetus, king of Thessaly, under whom Apollo once had served when he was a slave on earth. To thank Admetus for his kindness, Apollo had persuaded the Fates not to cut his thread of life when his time to die had come. as long as Admetus could find someone else willing to die in his stead. That would be easy, thought the king. His faithful men were always saying that his life was dearer to them than their own. King Admetus had always been afraid of dying early, for he was very happy with his beautiful queen Alcestis. The king and the queen were both fond of Heracles, and always welcomed him warmly. But one day when Heracles came to the palace, King Admetus greeted him alone. He looked sad and downcast. When Heracles asked him what was wrong, he said nothing except that a woman of the household had died and he must go to her funeral. And he left Heracles alone with the servants. They too looked sad. They waited on him in silence and did not answer his questions. Heracles ate, drank, and made merry alone, and at last he grew impatient, grasped one of the servants, and forced him to speak. The servant told him that the time had come for Admetus to die, and he had turned to his men and asked one of them to die in his stead, but now not one of them had been willing. Admetus then went to his parents, who were old and weary of life, and asked them to die in his stead. They too refused. But when he returned to the palace, he found Queen Alcestis setting off for the realm of the dead. She loved him so much, she said, she would gladly give her life for him, and the king was so fond of his own life that he let his queen depart. Now the king and all the household were mourning for Alcestis. Heracles shed big tears when he heard this sad story, but being a man of action, he seized his club and strode off to the underworld to force Hades to give Alcestis back. Such a loving wife should not be allowed to die. Heracles did not have to use his club. Cerberus slunk out of the way as he stormed into the palace of Hades. The Lord of the Dead himself had a cold, unloving queen, and he was so moved when Heracles told him of Alcestis' devotion that he let her go. Heracles brought Queen Alcestis back to King Admetus, and the grief in the palace changed to great joy. Now they all ate, drank, and made merry together, and Alcestis grew famous far and wide as the most devoted wife who ever lived. Heracles too wanted a wife, and he chose Deianira, a Caledonian princess, for his bride. Deianira had already been promised to the river god Achilles, but she dreaded the thought of being married to a river god who could change his shape at will. She would never know in which shape her husband would come home at night. She would rather marry the great hero Heracles. The two suitors agreed to wrestle, the victor to have the princess Deianira. Of course, Heracles won. The river god rushed at him in the shape of a bull, and Heracles seized him by a horn, wrenched it off, and threw him to the ground before he had time to change into something else. So Heracles and Deianira were married and were very happy together. One day as they were traveling, they came to a swollen stream. Heracles forded it with ease, but Deianira was afraid and stood on the bank. Along came the centaur Nessus, and politely offered to carry her across. But Nessus, like all centaurs, was fond of pretty girls, and before he had reached midstream, he had made up his mind to carry her off. Once on the other side, he galloped off with her. Deianira screamed for help. Heracles shot a poisoned arrow at the centaur, and Nessus fell to the ground. Before he died, he whispered to Deianira, "Take some of my blood and save it. If you ever fear that you are losing your husband's love, paint some of the blood on his tunic, and he will love you again." Deianira carefully saved the drops of blood, for she knew well that many a girl would like to steal her magnificent husband. One day, as Heracles was away at war, he won a great victory and sent a messenger home for his best tunic. He wanted to celebrate with his men, but Deianira thought he wanted to make himself handsome for a girl. She painted some of Nessus's blood on the tunic. As soon as Heracles put it on, he felt as though 1,000 fires were burning him. It was not a love potion that Nessus had given Deianira, but the deadly poison of the Hydra from Heracles' arrow, mixed with Nessus's blood. Heracles was so strong that the poison could not kill him, but his sufferings were unbearable. He ordered his men to build a funeral pyre, spread his lion skin over the top, and lay down on it. Then he gave his bow and deadly arrows to his young friend Philoctetes as a parting gift. As the flames rose around him, a loud thunderclap was heard, and Heracles, by the order of Zeus, rose up to Olympus, reclining on his lion skin. The gods all welcomed Heracles and were glad to have him with them, for the fates had predicted that Olympus would be attacked by a fearful enemy, and the Olympians could be saved only if the strongest man ever born fought on their side. The prediction soon came to pass. In a last effort to defeat the mighty thunder god Zeus, Mother Earth had given birth to 50 snake-legged giants, who surrounded Olympus and tried to storm the palace. They seemed unconquerable, for like Antaeus, whom Heracles had fought on earth, they sprang up again revived as soon as they touched Mother Earth. Heracles knew what to do, and with his help the gods won over the giants and cast them down into the dismal pit of Tartarus. Heracles was now the hero of Mount Olympus, beloved by all the gods. Even Hera begged him to forgive her and gave him her daughter Hebe, goddess of eternal youth, for his Olympian bride. From then on, Heracles lived in eternal bliss, forever a joy to the gods. His father Zeus was very pleased. Theseus. The Muses sang of Heracles and his labors, and they also sang of the island of Crete, ruled by King Minos, the son of Zeus and Europa. His queen, Pasiphae, a daughter of the sun god Helios, had a golden glimmer in her eyes like all the descendants of the sun, and was accustomed to great magnificence. King Minos wanted his queen to live in a palace as splendid as her father's, and he ordered Daedalus, an Athenian architect and inventor of marvelous skill, to build the great palace of Knossos. The palace rose up story upon story over a forest of columns. Winding stairs and intricate passageways connected the many halls and courtyards. Pictures were painted on the walls of the great halls, fountains splashed in the courtyards, and the bathrooms even had running water. Bulls' horns of the pierced gold crowned the roofs, for the Cretans worshipped the bull, since Zeus, in the shape of a bull, had brought Europa to the island. Here the king and the queen and all their court lived in great splendor and happiness until one day Poseidon sent a snow-white bull from the sea. Since the island of Crete was completely surrounded by his domain, the sea, he too wanted to be honored, and ordered King Minos to sacrifice the bull to him. But Queen Pasiphae was so taken by the beauty of the white bull that she persuaded the king to let it live. She admired the bull so much that she ordered Daedalus to construct a hollow wooden cow so she could hide inside it and enjoy the beauty of the bull at close range. Poseidon was very angry, and for punishment he made the bull mad. It ravaged the whole island, and though the Cretans were great bullfighters, no one could subdue the beast until Heracles had come to capture it for one of his labors. To punish the king and queen, Poseidon caused Pasiphae to give birth to a monster, the Minotaur. He was half man, half bull, and ate nothing but human flesh. Such a fearful monster could not go free, and the clever Daedalus constructed for him a labyrinth under the palace. It was a maze of passageways and little rooms from which nobody could ever hope to find his way out. There the Minotaur was shut in, and as long as he was provided with victims to devour, he kept quiet. When he was hungry, he bellowed so loudly that the whole palace shook. King Minos had to wage war with the neighboring islands so he could supply the Minotaur with the prisoners of war for food. When a son of Minos visited Athens and was accidentally killed, King Minos used this as an excuse to threaten to sack the city. Unless 7 Athenian maidens and 7 Athenian youths were sent to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur every 9 years. 2 times 9 years had passed, and the king was growing old. For the 3rd time a ship with black sails of mourning was due to depart, when word came to the king that a young hero, Theseus, from Trozen, was making his way to Athens, destroying all the monsters and highwaymen he met on the road. When King Aegeus heard that, his old heart beat faster. Once in his youth he had visited Trozen and had been secretly married to Princess Aethra. He did not bring Aethra back to Athens with him, but before he left he said to her, "Should you bear me a son, and should he grow up strong enough to lift this boulder under which I hide my sword and golden sandals, send him to me, for then he will be the worthy heir to the throne of Athens." King Aegeus in those days was known for his great strength. Theseus, the young hero, arrived in Athens and went straight to the king's palace. Tall and handsome, he stood before Aegeus with the sandals and the sword, and the king was overjoyed. At last he had a son who was a hero as well. The king happily proclaimed Theseus the rightful heir to the throne of Athens, and he became the hero of all Athens when he offered to take the place of one of the victims who were to be sent to Crete. Old King Aegeus begged his son not to go, but Theseus would not change his mind. "I shall make an end of the Minotaur, and we shall return safely," he said. "We sail with black sails, but we shall return with white sails as a signal of my success." The ship sailed to Crete, and the 14 young Athenians were locked in a dungeon to await their doom. But King Minos had a lovely daughter, Ariadne, as fair a maiden as eyes could see. She could not bear the thought that handsome Theseus should be sacrificed to the ugly Minotaur. She went to Daedalus and begged for help to save him. He gave Ariadne a magic ball of thread and told her that at midnight, when the Minotaur was fast asleep, she must take Theseus to the labyrinth. The magic ball of thread would roll ahead of him through the maze and lead him to the monster, and then it was up to Theseus to overpower the beast. In the dark of the night, Ariadne went to Theseus's prison and whispered that if he would promise to marry her and carry her away with him, she would help him. Gladly Theseus gave his word, and Ariadne led him to the gate of the labyrinth, tied the end of the thread to the gate so he would find his way back, and gave him the ball. As soon as Theseus put the ball of thread on the ground, it rolled ahead of him through dark corridors, upstairs, downstairs, and around winding passageways. Holding on to the unwinding thread, Theseus followed it wherever it led him, and before long he heard the thunderous snoring of the Minotaur. And there, surrounded by skulls and bleached bones, lay the monster, fast asleep. There's Theseus. You can see the thread there. Theseus sprang at the Minotaur. It roared so loudly that the whole palace of Knossos shook. But the monster was taken by surprise, and so strong was Theseus that with his bare hands he killed the cruel Minotaur. Theseus quickly followed the thread back to Ariadne, who stood watch at the gate. Together they freed the other Athenians and ran to their ship in the harbor. Before they sailed, they bored holes in all of King Minos' ships so he could not pursue them. Ariadne urged them to hurry, for even she could not save them from Talos, the bronze robot who guarded the island. If he should see their ship leaving, he would throw rocks at it and sink it. Should one of them manage to swim ashore, Talos would throw himself into a blazing bonfire until he was red hot. Then he would burn the survivor to ashes in a fiery embrace. They could already hear his clinking steps, when just in time they hoisted their sail, and a brisk wind blew them out to sea. In their rush they forgot to hoist the white sail of victory instead of the black sail of mourning. Theseus's heart was filled with joy. Not only had he saved the Athenians from the Minotaur, he was also bringing a beautiful bride home to Athens. But in the middle of the night the god Dionysus appeared to him and spoke. "I forbid you to marry Ariadne. I myself have chosen her for my bride. You must set her ashore on the island of Naxos." Theseus could not oppose an Olympian god. When they came to Naxos, he ordered everyone to go ashore and rest. There Ariadne fell into a heavy slumber, and while she slept, Theseus led the others back on the ship, and they sailed off without her. Poor Ariadne wept bitterly when she awoke and found herself deserted. Little did she suspect that the handsome stranger who came walking toward her was the god Dionysus, and that it was he who had ordered Theseus to abandon her. The god gently dried her tears and gave her a drink from the cup in his hand, and right away the sadness left her. She smiled up at the god, and he put a crown of sparkling jewels on her head and made her his bride. They lived happily together for many years, and their sons became kings of the surrounding islands. Dionysus loved Ariadne greatly, and when she died, he put her jeweled crown into the sky as a constellation, so she would never be forgotten. Theseus, in his grief at having lost Ariadne, again forgot to hoist the white sail. When King Aegeus saw the black-sailed ship returning from Crete, he threw himself into the sea in despair. Theseus inherited his father's throne, and he and all of Athens mourned the loss of the old king, and in his honor named the sea in which he had drowned the Aegean. King Minos was beside himself with fury when he discovered that his daughter had fled with the Athenians. He knew that no one but the brilliant Daedalus could have helped Theseus unravel the mystery of the labyrinth, so Daedalus was kept a prisoner in the palace and treated very harshly. Daedalus could not bear to be locked up and let his talents go to waste. Secretly, he made 2 sets of wings, 1 pair for himself and 1 pair for his son Icarus. They were cleverly fashioned of feathers set in beeswax. He showed his son how to use them and warned him not to fly too high, or the heat of the sun would melt the wax. When he led them up to the highest tower, and flapping their wings, they flew off like 2 birds. Neither King Minos nor Talos the robot could stop their flight. Young and foolish Icarus could not resist the temptation to rise ever higher into the sky. The whole world seemed at his feet. He flew too close to the sun and the wax began to melt. Feathers came loose, the wings fell apart, and Icarus plunged into the sea and drowned. Sadly, Daedalus flew on alone and came to the island of Sicily. His fame had flown ahead of him, and the king of Sicily welcomed him warmly, for he too wanted a splendid palace and bathrooms with running water. As soon as King Minos' ships were mended, he set off in pursuit of Daedalus, the cunning craftsman. He sailed east and he sailed west, and when he came to the Sicilian shore and saw the wondrous palace going up, he had no doubts who was building it. But the king of Sicily hid Daedalus and denied that he had him in his service. Slyly, King Minos set a conch shell up in the palace with a message that if anyone could pull a thread through the windings of the conch, he would give him a sack of gold as a reward. The king of Sicily asked Daedalus to solve the problem. Daedalus thought a while, then he tied a silken thread to an ant, put the ant at one end of the conch shell, and a bit of honey at the other end. There it is. The ant smelled the honey and found its way through the conch, pulling the thread along with it. When King Minos saw this, he demanded the immediate surrender of Daedalus, for now he had proof that the king of Sicily was hiding him. Nobody but Daedalus could have threaded the conch. The king of Sicily had to give in. He invited Minos to a feast, promising to surrender Daedalus. As was the custom, King Minos took a bath before the feast. But when he stepped into the fabulous bath that Daedalus had built, boiling water rushed out of the tap and scalded him to death. And Daedalus remained for the rest of his life at the court of the king of Sicily. After the death of King Minos, there was peace between Crete and Athens, and Theseus married Phaedra, Ariadne's younger sister. He became the greatest king Athens ever had, and his fame as a hero spread all over Greece. Another great hero, Pirithous, king of the Lapith people in northern Greece, was his inseparable friend. The first time the two heroes had met, they faced each other in combat, but each was so impressed by the other that, instead of fighting, they dropped their weapons and swore eternal friendship. Together they performed many great deeds, and when Pirithous was married a Lapith princess, Theseus, of course, was invited to the wedding feast. The centaurs were invited too, for though wild and lawless, they were nonetheless distant relatives. At first they behaved quite mannerly, but as the wine jugs were passed around, they became boisterous and rowdy. Suddenly a young centaur sprang up, grasped the bride by the hair, and galloped away with her. At that, the other centaurs each grasped a screaming girl, and set off to the hills. Theseus and Pirithous, with their men, set off in swift pursuit, and soon caught up with the centaurs. There was a brutal battle, for the wild centaurs tore big trees and swung them as clubs. But in Theseus and Pirithous they had found their masters. They were chased out of Greece, and the victorious heroes with the bride and the other Lapith girls returned to the feast. Pirithous lived happily for a while. Then he became a widower and asked his friend Theseus to help him win a new bride. Theseus vowed to help him, but shuddered when he heard that Pirithous wanted no one less than Persephone, the queen of the dead. She was unhappy with Hades, he said. Since Theseus had promised to help his friend, and a promise could not be broken, he descended to the underworld with Pirithous. They forced their way past Cerberus and entered the gloomy palace. Hades glowered at the two heroes who had dared to enter his realm, but he listened politely while they stated their errand. "Sit down on that bench," he said, "so we can discuss the matter." Grim Hades smiled as the two friends sat down, for it was a magic bench from which no one could ever rise. There they were to sit forever, with ghosts and bats flitting about their heads. A long time later, Heracles came to Hades on an errand, and pitied the two heroes trying vainly to get up from the bench. He took hold of Theseus and tore him loose with a mighty tug. But when he tried to free Pirithous, there came a loud earthquake. The gods did not allow Heracles to set him free, for he had shown too great irreverence by daring to want a goddess for a wife. Theseus returned to Athens wiser but thinner, for a part of him had remained stuck to the bench. Ever since, the Athenians have had lean thighs. Is that true? Anyway, Oedipus. One day, a blind old man came to Theseus and asked for permission to stay in his kingdom and die in peace. No one dared let him stay in their country, for he was pursued by the avenging Furies, the Erinyes. Homeless, he wandered about. The old man, whose name was Oedipus, then told Theseus his sad story. His misfortunes had started before he was born. His father, King Laius of Thebes, had been told by the oracle of Delphi that the child his queen Jocasta was carrying was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. This must never happen, thought the king. So when Oedipus was born, he ordered a servant to take the child away and abandon him in the mountains. But destiny had willed it differently. A shepherd from the neighboring kingdom of Corinth heard the child's cries. He picked up the little boy and carried him to his king. The king and queen of Corinth were childless, and happily they adopted the handsome little boy. They loved him dearly, and he never knew that he was not their real son. Without a care in the world, he grew to manhood, and one day went to Delphi to find what the future had in store for him. Great was his horror when he heard the words of the oracle. He was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. This must never happen, thought Oedipus. He took destiny in his own hands and fled across the mountains, never to see his dear parents again. On a narrow mountain path he met the chariot of a haughty lord. "Give way for our master's chariot," shouted the servants, and tried to push Oedipus off the path. Angrily, Oedipus fought back, and in the struggle the lord and all his servants were killed, except for one who escaped. Oedipus continued on his way and came to the city of Thebes. But its 7 gates were closed. Nobody dared to enter or leave, for a monster, the Sphinx, had settled on a cliff just outside the city wall. This winged monster with a woman's head and a lion's body, there you go, challenged all who passed by to solve her riddle. If they couldn't, she tore them to pieces. Nobody had yet solved the riddle of the Sphinx. What creature is it that walks on 4 feet in the morning, on 2 at noon, and on 3 in the evening? She asked with a sinister leer when she saw Oedipus. It is man, Oedipus answered. As a child, he crawls on 4. When grown, he walks upright on his 2 feet, and in old age, he leans on a staff. The Sphinx let out a horrible scream. Her riddle was solved, and she had lost her powers. In despair, she threw herself to her death. The gates of Thebes burst open, and the people crowded out to thank the stranger who had freed them. Their old king had recently been killed, leaving no son to inherit the throne, and when they heard that Oedipus was a prince from Corinth, they asked him to marry their widowed queen and become their king. To be sure, Queen Jocasta was much older than Oedipus, but she was still beautiful, for she wore a magic necklace that the gods had given Harmonia, the first queen of Thebes. Those who wore that necklace stayed young and beautiful all their lives. Thus Oedipus became king of Thebes, and he ruled the city justly and wisely for many years. One day the news reached him that the king of Corinth had died the peaceful death of old age, and while he mourned his father, he was glad that he had been spared from a terrible destiny. Shortly afterward, a pestilence broke out in Thebes, and people died in great numbers. Oedipus sent for a seer and asked how he could save his people. The pestilence would last until the death of the old king had been avenged, said the seer. Oedipus swore that he would find the man who had killed the old king and put out his eyes. He sent his men to search till they found the one surviving servant of King Laius's party. When he was brought before King Oedipus, the servant recognized him at once as the slayer of the old king, and now the whole terrible truth came out. For he was also the self-same servant who had abandoned the infant Oedipus in the mountains, and had known all the while that the child had been found and adopted by the king of Corinth. In despair, Queen Jocasta went to her room and took her own life, and Oedipus in horror put out his own eyes and left Thebes, a broken old man. His daughter Antigone went with him, and they wandered from place to place, turned away from every city, till at last they came to Athens. Not cursed but blessed will be the place where you lie down and close your eyes, said Theseus when he had heard the story. No man could have tried harder than you to escape his destiny. The avenging Erinyes, who had been chasing him, now dropped their whips, and Oedipus could die in peace. His 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, had no regard for the sufferings of their father. They stayed in Thebes and fought over the throne. At last they agreed to take turns being king, 1 year at a time. Eteocles ruled Thebes first, and when his year was up, he refused to give up the throne. Polynices left Thebes in a rage, taking with him the magic necklace of Harmonia, vowing to return with an army and take his rightful throne by force. He went to his father-in-law, the king of Argos, and tried to persuade him to send an army to Thebes. The king had an aging and very vain sister, who had great influence over him. Polynices promised her the magic necklace of Harmonia, which would make her young and beautiful again, if she could persuade her brother to go against Thebes. So great are the powers of a vain woman, that not only the king of Argos and his men, but 7 armies of brave men set forth with Polynices to storm the 7 gates of Thebes, most of them never to return. Neither could the 7 armies storm the 7 gates of Thebes, nor could the Thebans drive the attackers away. So it was decided that the 2 brothers should fight in single combat, the winner to be king. Eteocles gave his brother a mortal wound, but Polynices, before he fell, dealt him a deadly blow in return. Side by side they lay dead on the field, and all the bloodshed had been in vain. The son of Eteocles became king of Thebes, and Harmonia's necklace, which had brought so much misfortune, was hung up in a temple in Delphi, so no woman could ever wear it again. Alright, and next time we read, we're going to read about Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night.